I'm Andrew Neil. This is Times Radio, live from New York, with 9 days to go till US Election Day. Donald Trump's bid for a second term as US President peaked here in Manhattan last night with a massive rally in the iconic Madison Square Garden. Team Trump saw this as taking the campaign into the heartland of the enemy. New York State hasn't voted for a Republican presidential candidate since Ronald Reagan in 1984. They know it's a long shot for Trump, but it's not clear last night made it any less of a long shot. New York has a huge Puerto Rican population, so it was hardly helpful when a pro-Trump comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, kicked off the rally like this.
It is absolutely wild times. It really, really is. And, there's a lot going on. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
But not content with mocking Jews, Palestinians and Hispanics, Mr. Hinchcliffe went on to call out a black man in the audience with a reference to watermelon. The irony is that Trump has been making inroads into the black and Hispanic votes like no other Republican candidate, much to the Democrats' consternation. But such is the somewhat chaotic nature of the Trump campaign, nobody had thought to vet the warm-up speaker's remarks. Another warm-up act likened Kamala Harris to a prostitute with, quote, pimp handlers. Yet another depicted her as the Antichrist. Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News bloviator turned shill for Trump, a man he once excoriated in private emails, mocked Harris, who has an Indian-Jamaican heritage. But to Carlson, she was a Samoan Malaysian with low IQ. Nope, I had no idea either. But the time Trump took to the stage, many long hours later, some of the audience had already drifted off. They continued to do so even as he spoke. Many were from out of town. The garden is over a massive railway station. No doubt many had trains to catch. Even as they left, Trump leant into what the New York Times this morning describes as a carnival of grievances, misogyny and racism, with rhetoric like this.
And I'm hereby calling for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or a law enforcement officer. Under Kamala, America is a sanctuary for criminals and for illegal aliens that are in our country illegally. I will immediately ban all sanctuary cities in the United States.
Now, it's not clear if last night's somewhat bizarre rally will change anything. Trump has said many outrageous things himself in this campaign, and it doesn't seem to harm him. So maybe what his uncouth warm-up acts say won't either. Team Harris has a worried look in its eyes. You could see that on the Sunday morning talk shows yesterday across the US news networks. They hope, however, that the dawning realization that Trump could well be winning might galvanize the anti-Trump forces to flock to the polls. We'll see. Last night gave them plenty of ammunition to encourage the anti-Trumpers to do just that. But if Team Harris fails to do it, then it probably doesn't deserve to win on November the 5th anyway. This is Andrew Neil on Times Radio, live from New York. Let's start with a Republican perspective on last night and what now lies ahead in the next 9 days. Doug McKinnon is a Republican commentator, former White House and Pentagon official, former press secretary to Bob Dole. He was once a presidential candidate and former speechwriter for Presidents Reagan and George Bush Sr. Doug, let me begin with this. Donald Trump has been making inroads into the black and Hispanic vote, especially among black and Hispanic men, much to the Democrats' chagrin. On what planet does it make sense to have warm-up acts at your biggest rally yet making racist fun of both?
Yeah, Andrew, thanks for having me on. Obviously that comedian's just an idiot. He shouldn't have been there. And I agree with you. Maybe somebody should have done a better job of vetting him. But ultimately, that's going to have no effect on the Trump vote whatsoever. Again, this election is coming down to, and I've written about it a number of times here in the United States, to bread and butter issues, to national security, to economic security. It's one of the things even Axios, which is a news site that you know well here in Washington, D.C., just recently reported that more and more Democrats believe, unfortunately for them, that Kamala Harris is going to lose. And one of the reasons they were talking about, even my own paper, The Hill in Washington, D.C., also said, look, it's about Democratic hubris as opposed to anything else. When the Democrats themselves, meaning Democratic voters, say, look, we do want to talk about immigration. We do want to talk about the economy. We do want to talk about crime in our neighborhoods. And Kamala Harris and the Democrats continually ignore what their own voters want to talk about, then that becomes, unfortunately, an issue. And Trump has capitalized on all those issues.
I get the point, Doug, that if the campaign was more focused on bread and butter issues, then Trump would likely win. I mean, most folks, they answer the famous Reagan question, do you think you're less well off or better well off than 4 years ago? Most folks think that they are less well off. But Team Trump's had some job trying to get their man to focus on bread and butter issues rather than things that he rambles about which aren't cutting through.
Well, but I disagree with that, Andrew, because he does talk about those issues quite a bit. Whether the left of center media reports that on their airwaves is another story entirely. But that is getting through. For instance, I was talking to a number of my blue-collar Democratic cousins and friends in my home state of Massachusetts. None of them who like President Trump's personality, but all of them just told me that basically they're going to vote for Trump because ultimately it's about their children and their grandchildren and about their economic security. And they're also worried about the world being on fire over the course of the last few years. And of course, for the United Kingdom, that's also a serious issue.
So you don't think that Team Trump should worry that the kind of thing we saw last night, and it was widely broadcast on prime time on a Sunday night, and of course all the breakfast shows in New York have been, across the country have been replaying it. You don't think that this kind of thing could galvanize those anti-Trumpers? They're anti-Trump, but they're not minded to vote, but they might well get off their sofas and go and vote now when they hear this, because it reminds them why they didn't vote for him in 2020.
Yeah, Andrew, I honestly don't believe it's going to have an effect because, again, I think the American voters are much brighter than some in the media are giving them credit for. And they understand, look, so here's this moron comedian that made some jokes. He's obviously a bigot. And it's one of those things where they're not going to connect that comedian to Trump. What they're going to connect to Trump is, again, the issues that he's been talking about for the last year and especially the last few months. And more importantly, the issues that Kamala Harris refuses to discuss. And it's even for members of the media, it's just amazing to them that she has not held a real press conference yet since she became the nominee. And again, the fact of the matter is that she is not good at speaking to reporters, and it makes her very nervous. And the voters realize that. They just want to have a better life. They want to have a better life for their children and grandchildren. And they believe ultimately that Trump is addressing those issues. We'll see what happens. I mean, I still believe that Trump's going to comfortably win on November 5th.
Democrats, never mind Republicans, never rated Kamala Harris. It was one reason why they didn't want to get rid of Joe Biden, at least until the famous debate. But I think she's turned out to be a better candidate than most thought, a better campaigner. Not great, not claiming that, but better than we thought, and at least good enough to make this a very tight race.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think it's that tight ultimately. Again, sort of the polls always undercount the Trump vote. And to your point, Andrew, there are a number of Democrats that I've spoken with and a number of Democrats that you've probably spoken with and read about over the last few weeks and months that really did want to have an open convention. These are Democrats that wanted that.
Indeed, most of them did want it. They were just never given the chance.
They weren't because guess what? They were big-footed by Barack Obama, by Nancy Pelosi, and by Chuck Schumer, and they had no chance to have an open convention. And I agree with you. There are a number of very strong Democratic candidates out there, but this isn't the ticket that most Democrats I know wanted. They didn't want Biden. They didn't want Harris, and that's what they're stuck with. And again, remember, I think what people are losing sight of, Andrew, is that in 2019, 2020, Kamala Harris was the first person out of that Democratic primary.
Sure.
Why?
Well, she didn't even make it to the primaries.
She didn't because it folded and she started with a big flare. But the problem is the more people heard her, and this is on the Democratic side of the equation, the less they liked her. And some of that is translating now into the general election.
Trump is a hard man to run against because he is kind of unique. There's never, ever been a candidate for president like this in the history of the Republic. And he's hard because he lives off it's a kind of cult of personality that he campaigns on. Should the Democrats have fought a different campaign given what they were up against?
Andrew, I think that's a great point, and it's something I've written about a few times here in the United States. And you look at sort of the Republican primary, right? Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, he ran against Donald Trump, and to your point, he didn't realize he was running against a cult of personality, or at least he didn't give it enough thought, because Trump comes into this election season with tens of millions of votes in his back pocket. And it's one of these things he has, whether people want to admit it or not, on the left, he has an it factor. He really does. And to your point, this is someone that comes along very, very rarely. And that actually does make a difference in how people look at him and again, what he brings to the table in terms of power. And he has capitalized on that it factor in a big way. And it's also hurting Kamala Harris.
Let me ask you this, Doug. The Republicans have a narrow majority in the House. The Democrats barely have a majority in the Senate. If you're right, if there's a fair win behind Trump, if he's going to win and just not squeak through, I think you said earlier you thought he might win quite comfortably in the end. Not a landslide, I know you're not talking about that, but relatively comfortably. He's not going to be just a smidgen. If that's true, do the Republicans take the House and the Congress and the Senate, both houses? Is it a clean sweep?
I believe they will, Andrew, because again, I think his coattails are going to be longer than anybody wants to admit right now. And, to your point, is it going to be my old boss, George H.W. Bush in 1988, is it going to be that kind of landslide? No. But is it going to be sort of what they're talking about now is if you have basically a 100 electoral vote margin in terms of you, then that is a mini landslide now. And I believe Trump's going to meet that mark. And if he does, then I think he brings the House and the Senate along with him.
I guess, though, if you're a moderate Republican or a non-Trump Republican or an independent, some moderate in the middle, suburban mom or something like that, you might think, okay, well, Trump's going to win the White House again. Not so sure about that. I better vote Democrat for the House and the Senate so that at least there's some balance in the different sectors of the governments in Washington.
I mean, you see that sometimes, obviously, Andrew, you're right. Are we going to split the ticket just because we happen to, like this person better, for our district or for our state? But I don't believe in terms of this now because of the agenda and what's going on, and because it's so clearly defined between both parties, right? Between both candidates. And so I think if people are going to vote for Trump, then they're also going to probably vote for a Republican representative in their state as well. Okay,
Doug, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's been good to talk to you. I say morning because I'm in New York. Doug McKinnon there, Republican commentator, former aide to Presidents Reagan and H.W. Bush. Kamala Harris and her running mate Tim Walz will barnstorm all 7 battleground states this week in a final get-out-the-vote effort starting today in Michigan, where Harris hasn't been doing too well and needs to improve. She spent yesterday crisscrossing Philadelphia. It's the biggest city in that swingiest of swing states, Pennsylvania. The city's rock-solid Democrat, but she's hoping to boost turnout, especially among blacks and Hispanics, to give her the edge statewide. Harris has called Trump a fascist and a threat to democracy, par for the course in a campaign notable for its intemperate language on both sides. She's even using some of the lines Team Trump used against Joe Biden, flipping them against Trump himself as too old and not mentally alert. But is it cutting through? Some of the Harris campaign fear not, but other Democrats are more optimistic. Let's speak now to Tom Bonnier, Senior Advisor at Target Smart. It analyzes U.S. political data. Tom, welcome. Let me start with this. There was a growing conviction last week, even among Democrats, and you saw it in the Democratic media, that the Harris campaign had failed to keep up its early momentum. There were signs that she was sort of the kind of lead that she needed over Trump to avoid defeat in the Electoral College. A lot of people still think that, but you don't. Explain why.
Well, for a few reasons. I mean, one, I'm a Democrat. This is my 30th year working in Democratic politics. I've been here before. It wouldn't be in October in an even number year if you didn't have a lot of nervous Democrats who are convinced somehow that the campaign is blowing at this time. What we do is we focus on the actual data. And when you look at the polling in this race, it's actually been remarkably stable. Usually you see the polling jumping around, a lot of lead changes. But nationally, when you look at the average of the polls, Vice President Harris has a narrow lead, but a fairly consistent lead. and she has a narrow but consistent lead in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes. It by no means she has this wrapped up. It certainly also doesn't mean that she's blowing the race in any way.
The problem with depending on the polls, though, is that for both Mr. Trump and Ms. Harris, their leads in the swing states are decimal points. In some it's 0.5, it's 0.6. You and I both know there's no way the polling is that accurate. And the Trump people still think the pollsters don't know how fully to count the blue-collar Trump voters, the shy Trumpers.
Yeah, you've got two sides of this argument where, as you say, the Trump campaign and Republicans say, look, Donald Trump has been on the ballot twice, and twice the polls have underestimated his support. Democrats say, true, but since the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, which was just a little over 2 years ago, Democrats have consistently outperformed polls. And in fact, in the 2022 elections, the midterm elections 2 years ago, the average poll missed by 5 points, which is a pretty big miss when you think about the margins that you were just talking about. And that was overwhelmingly overestimating Republicans. The last point that I'll make on this is, though they say that Donald Trump always overperforms his polls, the one time he didn't was in the presidential primaries this year, where in 19 out of 20 states where they had enough polls for these poll averages, Donald Trump actually dramatically underperformed his polls in these primaries. Now, we can't compare primaries to generals exactly, but the fact is there is a record of that happening. We know the political world did change dramatically after the Dobbs decision. So both sides have an argument to make here.
It's certainly true in the midterms in 2022, Trump underperformed in the sense that the people Trump backed didn't do that well. That's why there wasn't a red wave, whereas the Republicans that Trump didn't back actually did pretty well. So I can understand that. But to what extent is the prospect of a Trump victory? Because I hear what you're saying, but the flaky consensus, if I can put it that way, is still that Trump will probably win. I'm not saying I necessarily share that, but that's where we are at the moment. To what extent that might galvanize people who don't like Trump but weren't thinking of voting to think, hey, this guy looks like he can win, I better go and vote for Harris?
Well, it's certainly one of the theories at this point from Democrats having lived through the 2016 election with an expectation that Hillary Clinton was going to cruise to victory, and it didn't happen. And we know in that case, a lot of Democrats stayed home because they thought she had it won. A number of Democrats actually voted for third-party candidates, Green Party candidates especially, because, again, they thought they could do it and it was safe and they wouldn't be losing the election. In 2020, it was almost worse, surprisingly, and that a lesson wasn't learned. The polls were actually more in Joe Biden's favor, and we know how that turned out. The polls were dramatically underestimating Trump's support. So I think there's less of a risk of that happening, though we do have short memories. We see how people actually view the Trump presidency much more favorably now that they're not living in the midst of it. So I don't think it's necessarily harmful that there is a perception that this is a very close race and that perhaps Vice President Harris has some ground to make up.
What do you make of something like the Madison Square Garden rally last night? And the reason I ask is to put it in a British context, that there was a famous Labour Party rally in the 1992 election. Neil Kinnock was then the Labour candidate. It was called the Sheffield Rally, and it was very much an American-style razzmatazz rally in Sheffield itself. And Kinnock blew it that night by being too triumphant, shouting, "Come on," and all right. And British people just didn't like that, and it turned against him. But it doesn't seem to work that way in the United States.
It doesn't. That's certainly one of the distinctions between y'all and us. But I do think something that, and we'll see in the closing week here, but when you look at the polling over the past year, and what I mentioned a moment ago, that people have sort of created this halo effect around Donald Trump and view him more favorably. Now, and don't get me wrong, they still don't view him all that favorably. But part of that's just because he was out of the public consciousness and out of the public eye. He largely wasn't around. The focus was on President Biden, and then the focus was on Vice President Harris. And what we found is the more that he is in the public eye, the more people are reminded that they're just exhausted by these sorts of things. When we see the racist jokes that were coming out of that, frankly, were not jokes, out of the rally.
Well, you're right. They weren't
last
jokes.
night.
They weren't jokes
Oh.
at all. They were just offensive.
No, they just offensive, racist statements. And so to see those, I think, is a reminder for a lot of Americans of exactly what they didn't like about the 4 years of the Trump presidency. So I'm not sure it was the smartest move, though. Donald Trump, these decisions are about ego. They're generally not about strategy. I think we give him a little bit too much credit as being a strategist.
Tom, it's 9 days to go. You look at the data, which is always useful. Having studied it, how would you advise Harris to fight these final days? What should she do, and what should her closing message be?
Well, look, they've built an incredibly strong campaign. They've raised more resources than any campaign ever has, and they did it in a fraction of the time anyone did. I think they're running an incredibly smart campaign. They've built a campaign around this moment, around this last week, in a close race, whereas the Trump campaign hasn't done that. We know a lot of the resources they've raised, which are significantly less than the Harris campaign, have gone to pay Donald Trump's legal bills. He bankrupted the Republican National Committee, the National Party. He outsourced the turnout efforts to Elon Musk. They have a lot of significant issues. So I think what we're seeing is the Harris campaign closing with strength. And so that message of strength, and frankly, a more aspirational message that we are better than this as Americans, is the right closing message, and it's what you're seeing from them.
Change days, Tom. I've covered every presidential election since Carter v. Ford in 1976, and for many of the years I've covered elections, it's always been the Republicans had the most money and the Democrats struggled to catch up. Now the Democrats have got a ton more money than the Republicans. American politics has stood on its head.
It very much is. It's quite unusual. I think a lot of people were surprised when they saw that $1 billion number that came out. It's entirely unprecedented, but it shows the sort of enthusiasm and excitement that, again, at least from the Harris campaign side, they're arguing that this is what isn't showing up in the polls, that there's more excitement, enthusiasm, and intensity among Democrats. It showed up in the fundraising. It's showing up in the early voting now. It showed up in new voter registration data. Will it show up next Tuesday? That's the final question to answer.
Well, before we had you on, Tom, we had a Republican strategist, and he said he thought Mr. Trump would not just win, but win reasonably comfortably. Not a landslide, he wasn't predicting that, but it would be more than just a smidgen. How do you see things, Tom?
Well, I'm not in the business of making predictions because it's a good way to look foolish. But in the end, as you say, when the polls show this within a point one way or the other, and we think about when in 2022, as I said, the average poll missed by 5 points, and we were actually told after the fact that was a pretty good year for polling. Well, that means either candidate is capable of winning by a fairly large electoral college vote margin. I think it's less likely for Donald Trump because he just doesn't have that same sort of path. And again, we haven't seen the intensity and enthusiasm from Republicans since the Dobbs decisions like we have seen from Democrats. So I think that favors the Harris campaign in terms of their ability to potentially do something winning by a larger margin than the polls would suggest.
Okay. We've only 9 days to find out. Well, I say only 9. Could be quite a few days after November the 5th before we know for sure. But Tom, we'll leave it there. Tom Bonnier, Democratic analyst. When he said there, I never make predictions, I thought he was going to quote Alex Ferguson saying, I don't make predictions and I never will. But he didn't, probably just as well. And in a very close presidential contest, it's possible the loser, whether Republican or Democrat, will contest the result with multiple court actions. Both sides are already lawyered up to the hilt, and I mean the hilt. Hundreds of lawyers have been signed up and thousands more legal volunteers. There's even speculation of a constitutional crisis if the election is slow or close, and inevitably it could all end up with the Supreme Court. Let's speak now to Professor Larry Kramer, Vice-Chancellor of the London School of Economics, former Dean of Stanford Law School, an expert on the court. Professor, thanks for joining us. Is it fair to assume, given some might say the bad example set in 2020, that if the winner just scrapes over the line this time, there will be multiple court challenges from the loser, especially in the swing states?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair guess. The really bad example, of course, was set in 2000, but we've been living with that one ever since.
That was the hanging chads in Florida.
Yeah.
So the Electoral College, so the country goes to the polls on November the 5th, either that night or probably more likely someday after we get an idea of what the result is. The court challenges could then come in fast and thick. The Electoral College votes, which choose the president, they're meant to be counted by January the 6th, the new president officially declared. If there's an avalanche of litigation, could that deadline be missed?
So again, anything could happen is the answer. I doubt it would happen because of an avalanche of litigation, though, only in the sense that the courts have been pretty good about handling the cases quickly. So there will undoubtedly be an avalanche of litigation. It will start before all the votes have been counted because they're counted at different paces in different states, and some of them go on quite some time. So the litigation will probably start right after. But I would be surprised if courts didn't get through the cases in time.
And they did last time. I mean, they had over 60 cases, and some of them they threw out right away, others they dealt with quickly. Professor, when would the Supreme Court, if it does, when would it come into play?
So again, it kind of is up to the court. All of this is extremely unpredictable is the short answer.
I understand.
We've had it happen a little bit. I think what we're likely or could see this time will make, what happened earlier look like early dress rehearsals, not even sort of well along the way. So it's going to be a little hard to tell. It's also hard to tell because the court has the capacity to reach down if need be and take cases and bring them up sooner or speed up the process.
And so the court can initiate action itself. It doesn't have to wait for someone to go to the court.
It can't exactly initiate the action itself, but parties can ask it to move faster, and they can skip steps, reach down all the way to a trial court. And again, you can assume parties will do whatever they need to in terms of trying to use the process to their advantage. So every option that exists is likely to be used, which is what makes it also unpredictable.
You mentioned the 2000 election, which was very close between Mr. Bush and Mr. Gore. The Supreme Court's ruling on Florida, I think at the time, was thought to be quite partisan, if I can put it that way. I guess that could happen again.
So even if it isn't partisan, it's going to seem partisan because it's going to have an outcome. And whoever loses is going to always think that the court has acted in a partisan manner. In fact, there's no question, I think, that it is partisan. The judges are judges. They're also people. They feel very strongly. The issues seem high, and they're in the middle of this maelstrom, which makes it really hard to maintain your objectivity. On this court, you've got at least a couple of the older justices who already have essentially all but thrown off any pretense of being anything other than partisan. That's only a couple of them, but it's enough to create a really strong sense. And as I say, I think it's a lot to ask anybody sitting in the middle of that I don't even know how you could put aside your partisan feelings. So there's no way of really escaping it.
I understand. In 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the vice president, who was handling the vote to the Electoral College votes on January the 6th, the day of the famous mob riot, of course, the vice president then was Mike Pence. Mr. Trump and his advisors claimed that the vice president had the power to strike down a state's slate for the Electoral College. I think the legal consensus among scholars like yourself was that wasn't true. And am I right in thinking there's been a bipartisan law since passed which clarifies the position of the vice president when it comes to the Electoral College?
Yes, that's right. The law has been amended in a number of ways so that the kind of mess that you had last time won't happen this time. Among other things, yes, they made crystal clear that the vice president's job is just to open the envelopes and not to exercise any discretion in deciding whether they should be admitted or not.
And of course, the vice president this time will be someone called Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, yeah.
She can hardly, if she's lost narrowly, it'd be quite difficult for her to strike that down, I would have thought, politically. Anyway.
Yeah, one would think so.
If there is, however, it goes the other way, if there is a Harris administration, she will face what I think Democrats will regard as a hostile Supreme Court. And I see talk that maybe the Supreme Court should be reformed. I think I'm right in saying, Professor, that the number of judges is not fixed in the Constitution, that Congress could change the number. You could add more Democrats. What chances do you think that she could try and pack the court?
Yes. So first, there are a number of ways in which by law, you can change the composition of the court. You can add justices, but you can change their jurisdiction. You can slash their budget. There's all sorts of possibilities and ways in which to discipline a court. Those have actually been used across American history in a number of instances, but there's essentially zero chance of them being used this time because they require a statute to be passed by Congress, and you're not going to get a statute through Congress. In the best of all possible worlds, the Democrats maybe retain one house, but not both. And even if they manage somehow to get both houses, they will not have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate.
In the Senate. So it would be very hard to get through Congress. I think the last president seriously to consider changing the composition of the court was FDR in the 1930s, when a lot of his New Deal legislation was thwarted by the court. Though the threat of a change, I think in the end, the Supreme Court kind of roughly fell in line.
Not roughly, they absolutely fell in line. They flipped
I was trying to be
exactly
polite.
in the way that he wanted. And then about 2 weeks later, one of them retired and he was able to appoint somebody. There have been other efforts since then. They just never kind of got off the ground. And the issues were not as profoundly, divisive within the political system that a president felt the need to really push it the way FDR did.
Is the American judiciary, partly because part of it's elected, parts of it are chosen by politicians, like the Supreme Court. It's always been more politicized than, say, the British judiciary. But is it more politicized now than ever before?
So yes. So first, the federal bench versus the state benches. You have direct elections and so on of judges at the state court level. The federal bench are all they're nominated by presidents and approved by Congress. So it's necessarily something that goes through the political process, but it's become much, much, much more politicized as the power of the court has grown and the stakes of, who's on the court, become much greater. So it started to change and become much, much more controversial back in the 50s after Brown v. the Board of Education, but really took off after the Bork nomination in 1986, which was the one in which really was brought home to the American public that who you put on the bench matters because they're going to have final say over important rights of yours. That wasn't really deep in the political culture prior to then. And then since then, every nomination for the Supreme Court is a huge, big deal, but even nominations for the lower courts are quite political.